Welcome back to the Commercial Property Podcast. And today we're going to be talking about lease renewals. Now, what I'm not going to do is go through all the case law and kind of try and bore you bit by bit in terms of the technical process. What I want you to understand today is why a lease renewal is important, how they work, and how practically you can get the very best out of your property by using lease renewals. So let's get going. So a lot of investors spend time looking for their next deal, but actually with commercial property, quite often a lot of the value can be sitting right in front of you in your existing property. And you know, there's events in leases such as rent reviews, maybe rent increases, on the positive side, break clauses from a landlord's perspective, more on the negative side, but also lease renewals. So when a lease ends, there is an option to renew that lease. So I'm going to explain to you how a lease renewal can potentially increase value, strengthen the lending appeal to banks, reduce your risk, or even create a repositioning opportunity for you. And you really do need to handle these things properly. So let's just understand quickly what a lease renewal is. So if you have a tenant occupying a property under a lease, that lease at some point will come to an end, whether that's in a year, 5 years, 10 years, 25 years. Eventually that lease will come to an end. Now, there's two types of leases. One is inside the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. Don't worry, I'm not going to bombard you with law, but this is important. So the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954 basically gives something called security of tenure. And what that means is if a lease is inside the 54 Act, and most leases are, unless you actively have to opt them out, you actively have to get a statutory demand signed by the tenant and yourselves to actually opt that lease out of the Landlord and Tenant Act. If a lease is inside the Act, then that tenant has an automatic right of renewal. So it basically gives businesses security that they can, fit out properties and they can trade from there without the fear of getting booted out. That's basically what it is. Now, as I say, you have to actively opt to lease out of the 1954 Act. And to do that, you'll get something called a statutory demand. I'm finding that one quite difficult to say. And basically what that is a document basically telling a tenant that they're giving up their rights to renew their lease or have an automatic renewal of their lease. Now, when would you have each type of tenancy? Well, from a landlord's perspective, if you just want to keep that property a long time, then and you're happy with your tenant, then you may well be more than relaxed in having it inside the 54 Act. If you want to redevelop, for example, you may want to opt that lease out of the 54 Act because there's only 7 grounds you can give at the end of a lease to not renew a lease inside the 1954 Act, including, breach by them in terms of not paying the rent or doing the repairs, or if you want to redevelop, or if you want to occupy it yourself, or if you want to subdivide it, for example. So you want, if you're going to redevelop, you would probably want the lease outside the Act, because that means that, the tenant will go anyway. Because the other thing about it is that if you have to contest a tenant who wants to stay because you want them out, because you want to do a redevelopment, you have to pay them compensation. And that's either 1 or 2 times rateable value, depending on how long they've been in the property. So you want to avoid that compensation piece. And, if you're redeveloping, you want that lease outside the Act. But every other occasion, you may want to keep your options open, or you may be more than happy to have that lease inside the 54 Act. So when you come to the end of that lease, and you can start these negotiations early, you can start them whenever you want, really, before the end of a lease, then you can start to negotiate with that tenant to stay. And there's certain notices you can serve to basically say to a tenant that you want them to stay, and here's the kind of lease terms that you want them to stay on. And from a landlord's perspective, that's a Section 25 notice. From a tenant's perspective, that's a Section 26 notice. So I'm going to leave the legal stuff there, and I'm going to talk to you now more about the practical aspects of it. So a lease renewal is important because the shorter a lease is, the less security you have in that property. You know, at the end of the day, a tenant, even though as a landlord you can't boot your tenant out, a tenant has a right to leave at the end of their lease if they want to. And so how a valuer will look at this, how a bank will look at this, and obviously how you should therefore be looking at it is that the shorter the lease, the more you're getting closer to that lease renewal date, the more risk there is. And from a valuer's perspective, that will be reflected in the yield. The yield would be higher, it would be more risky, and because there's less security of term. So therefore, a valuer will see that as risky. And by the way, a valuer always assume the worst case scenario, unless you can convince them otherwise. So obviously that's our job as investors. But, you know, a valuer will assume that that tenant will leave. So unless you show them written evidence that they're going to stay, or, you know, an agreement for them to stay, or whatever else it might be, then a valuer will always assume that the tenant will leave. So the more you tick down to that lease renewal, the more the hit on your valuation is going to be, the more the yield's going to move out, and the more the risk there is of that particular investment. So what we want to do, obviously, with our commercial investing is make it less risky, because when it's a less risky investment, yields come down, prices go up, and everybody's feeling much happier about the world. You know, banks are happier, that they can see less risk. You know, nobody wants loads of risk in properties. So that's why kind of buying a property on a short lease can be a good thing. As long as you've done your due diligence beforehand, you've spoken to the tenant, you understand whether they want to stay or not. You may want them to stay or you may not, depending on your strategy, but equally you should really know what the situation is. But ultimately you would be buying that property at a lower price because of the risk of that tenant leaving. And ultimately the name of the game obviously is to asset manage, is to do paper-based asset management in this case, i.e. doing the lease renewal, which means that off the back end of it, your property is going to be less risky because you've got a longer term lease in place, and therefore your property is going to be valued up. A valuer is going to be feeling so much better about the world, as is a lender, as is you. So a lease renewal could mean a tenant leaving. So obviously before you buy the property, or even if you own the property, you need to be having those conversations early on. How are they trading? Do they want to stay? Don't they want to stay? You know, you don't want to be getting to the lease expiry date and having those conversations. You want to get that nice and front loaded. It might involve a new lease being granted. It might be, it probably definitely will be, the rent will be reviewed through negotiation. So at the end of a lease, no matter what the rent is, it will go to open market value. And so you want to provide kind of comparables to the tenant that kind of, obviously from a landlord's point of view, shows high comparables, and the tenant undoubtedly will be showing you comparables to lower rents. It might mean that the property becomes vacant. It might mean that you redevelop the property or have alternative plans or split it up or whatever. And it will involve a formal process under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. So because these things can get a little bit complicated, I would definitely have the conversations yourself with a tenant, but you may want to consider bringing a professional in. And local local commercial agent companies, they will have leasing teams, they'll have investment teams, but they'll have a team which is called a professional team, a rent review team, and lease renewal team, a landlord and tenant team. That's a team you're looking for to deal with lease renewals, because what they do is they deal with this stuff every single day of the week. So they know the process, they understand how things work. And actually, from my point of view, at this point of the process, it's more important having a surveyor involved than a solicitor. A solicitor won't handle the negotiations for you. They may document things on the back end, but you want a practical approach. So what a landlord and tenant surveyor would do for you is prepare a report with all the comparables. They will help you with a strategy, and then you can go off and either instruct them to carry this out on your behalf, or you could do it yourself. So lease renewals definitely affect capital value, because once that lease renewal is, the new lease is in place, then your value is going to be higher, the property is going to be less risky, you're going to obviously be looking at higher risk and lower values before that lease renewal happens. So that's really, really important. So it will affect the yield because of the inherent risk. All that yields are, or the multiplier that we apply to the rent, is a reflection of risk. We call it the all risks yield because it reflects the risk of the property. And whilst there might be a comparable yield locally of similar types of property, that will flex depending on the length of your lease, the quality of your tenant, the quality of your lease terms, etc. It'll also potentially affect bank lending appetite. So if you buy a property where there is a short-term lease in place, you may want to get that lease renewal done before you go on to term finance. Now, obviously, every situation is different. So definitely check that out with a broker and with your surveyor. But, that may be a strategy you may want to look at. It may affect saleability because there's a short lease in place. The market will thin because less people want that kind of uncertainty. It also obviously will affect your income security, your tenant retention, and your asset management upside as well. So sometimes the biggest uplift in value doesn't come from buying well. Sometimes it comes from actually what's right in front of you and managing well. So this is what the lease renewal process is. So the step-by-step process to manage a lease renewal would be, obviously consider bringing a professional in to help you. I can't kind of stress that enough, especially if it starts to get even vaguely confrontational between you and the tenant. But a year, 18 months, maybe a bit more out, you want to be having regular contact with the tenant. You should be having regular contact with your tenants anyway. Gone are the days when we just spoke to our tenants at rent review and lease renewal dates. If you build up some form of relationship with your tenants outside of those confrontational relationships, you'll find that things will go a lot smoother when you do have to have those kind of awkward conversations. So you want to really have an understanding of how they're trading, whether they want to stay in the property, because obviously if they have no intention to, you want to know about that very early on so that you can think about alternative strategies. Certainly as well, if you're buying, you need to be speaking to the incumbent tenant very early on to see whether they're going or they're staying. And that may not affect your purchase, but it certainly will affect your strategy for sure. So you want to review the existing lease. You want to look at the renewal date, obviously whether it's inside or outside the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. You want to look at break clauses. You want to look at rent review history. You want to look at where the rent is in comparison to open market rents, repairing terms, guarantors, covenant strength of the tenant, etc. And then you also want to understand the market. What actually, if that property was to let in the market right now, and you can get this from commercial agents, what would it let for? What kind of lease terms would you get? What kind of rent review provisions would you get? Would you have to pay any rent-free period? Would you have to pay any capital contributions? What's supply and demand? What's the competing space nearby? If you're coming up to a lease renewal and there's, 20 other very similar properties on the high street that are to let, then the chances are your tenant's going to be playing very much hardball on that negotiation. Whereas actually, if they're the only one, if there's nothing available, they're the only one that could be available, and they're trading well, then you can see how the situation might differ there. And then decide on your strategy. Do you want income security? Do you want a higher rent? So do you want long lease? Do you want a higher rent? Do you want flexibility because you might want, do you want break clauses because you might want to redevelop? Do you want to replace the tenant? Not that you necessarily can if it's inside the Act. So
this episode is brought to you by Bond Finance Limited, your trusted partner for commercial property mortgage solutions. Are you an experienced residential property investor about to diversify into commercial property, looking for funding options? Bond Finance can help. Whether you're planning to expand, refinance, or make a major property investment, Bond Finance provides expert advice with access to a wide range of lenders, from high street to specialist. Book a free discovery session today to explore how we can tailor commercial funding solutions to your unique investment strategy. Visit www.bondfinanceltd.co.uk and take the next step in your commercial finance journey.
this is where starting with the end in mind is really important. What do you actually want to be able to, to really kind of understand your negotiation and get the very best out of it. Then you would, there's various notices that would go backwards and forwards. There would be a negotiation on rent, on lease terms. A tenant, if they serve a notice, will be clear about what they want, whether they want short-term leases and of course, or longer-term leases, what kind of rent. And of course, everyone's playing a bit of a game at this point because, there's a bit of a standoff. So try and avoid this if you can, because it involves a lot of cost if you're not careful. Ultimately, it could run to court, or you could be going to mediation or arbitration, and you don't really want to go there. So it's much better to be amicable, but equally, you need to obviously get what you want, and you need to have an idea of what's achievable. And, if you're miles apart, you may need to run it to some form of mediation, arbitration, or even to court, especially if you think you've got a strong position. But try and avoid that if you can, because nobody wants that hassle in their life. And actually, things are done much better by negotiation if you possibly can. This is where bringing a surveyor in can really help you with this. So negotiating heads of terms, rents, etc. And then obviously once you've negotiated that lease renewal, you will then go to solicitors who will document it, put the new lease in place, etc. So you need to make sure you're following that process properly and you understand how to do it. And just by the by, if you do serve notices like a Section 25, make sure your solicitor does it, because otherwise they could be served wrong, and then you're in a world of trouble. So just make sure you're serving things properly. Now, just a word of warning: if that lease is outside the Act, so it's an opted out lease under the Landlord and Tenant Act 54, it's not within those provisions, then what you mustn't do is allow a tenant to stay in the property. You need to basically tell them that they have no security of tenure and they need to leave. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to boot them out straight away, but you need to speak to your solicitor about ways of kind of protecting your position. But if a lease is inside the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, then the tenant can stay occupying under the previous lease, just paying the rent as they go. That's called holding over. So it's called holding over under the previous lease. So if you see on particulars where it says holding over, that's exactly what it means, that they're holding over under their previous lease. All the previous lease provisions will work. A tenant can apply for something called interim rent, which basically will change the rent, but they'd only really do that if the rent was obscenely high. And some, especially blue chip tenants, if the lease renewal negotiation drags on for a year or so, because sometimes they can, will be trying to backdate the rent. So you need to take a view on that yourself. So what's really important is that you know when these dates are in your portfolio. You need to make sure that you don't let these things pass you by. I see a lot of property that I look at to buy where investors are very hands-off, and you can be really hands-off with commercial property, but it doesn't mean that you are completely ignoring your properties. What you want to do is you want to make sure you've got flags on your system. There's certain dates that are just really important. So what you mustn't do is leave it too late. Also, you don't want to just kind of helicopter into your tenant when there's this lease renewal happening. You want to kind of understand, build up a trading picture, understand how happy they are, what they want to do well before that lease renewal starts. You need to obviously, you should know what your lease is, but you want to be checking again if the lease is inside or outside the Act. You don't want to just focus on rent. What's important about leases is the whole thing, all the different clauses, because it's all very well getting a little rent uplift, but actually, if the new lease has different repairing obligations and the tenant doesn't need to, doesn't have a full repairing and insuring lease anymore, then that's potentially a problem. You also need to kind of find out what's happening, in the wider market and have a really good understanding of that. You might not want to, you want to understand your tenant covenant as well. So do tenant checks at the end of a lease. So you should be doing these all the way through the lease term, by the way, just because, you need to constantly check in on tenants because businesses can change. And you want to make sure that, that they are still good for their money. They're a good covenant. And if they're not, you want to be introducing, if you can, guarantors, guarantees, etc., because, you want to make sure that your position is protected. If you want to redevelop, then you need to obviously do that strategy well ahead of time when you're granting the lease. It might be that you want a tenant in there just to cover the costs and to pay some rent for a couple of years, but start with the end in mind, work out what you need to do, opt that lease outside the Landlord and Tenant Act, and make sure that you really understand how to do that. Make sure that your solicitor documents everything, serves the right notices, and have a plan for your negotiation. Bring an expert in if you need to, like I said. Solicitors document deals, but they don't create the strategy. That's down to you and potentially your surveyor that you engage. So there's lots of hidden profit opportunities in lease renewals. Things like, extending that lease term can massively improve value. You could improve the lease wording as part of your lease renewal negotiation. You could remove break clauses. You could improve the rent review wording. You could bring in excess space, or, the tenant could surrender space back to you so that you can bring other uses in. That could be great. You could, if you see that they're not, doing an inspection and you see they're not using space, then they might want to hand that back to you. And that could be a gold asset management opportunity for you. They might want to refit their property, and it might be that actually, they want to refit and stay longer. So, if you actually contributed a bit towards that refit, would they actually take a longer lease term? Would they pay you a higher rent? And it might be that you actually get a payback very, very quickly on that. So don't just look at it narrowly as I want to renew the lease. Look at it where the other opportunities are to add value. And that's why you need to be highly strategic with lease renewals. So, leases materially affect value in commercial property, and never more than at a lease renewal stage. And, start early, make sure you engage agents early on, model multiple scenarios, make sure you absolutely understand your numbers before you get going, review that tenant strength, take professional advice, and think highly strategically. And really importantly, build those relationships with the tenants, so you're not just helicoptering in as an absentee landlord when you want something, because that is rightly perceived as being really, really cynical. So lease renewals can add value massively. There's process you need to follow. Hopefully today I've explained to you exactly how they work, but obviously there's nothing like actually rolling your sleeves up and getting involved in a lease renewal. But I would strongly recommend, certainly on your first one, but just put in context, I would employ an agent to do a lease renewal for me, because I've got lots of other things to do in my portfolio. So, don't discount using other people who are experts. But as ever, it's your property. So make sure you strongly control the strategy. You absolutely understand what they're doing, and they check in with you very, very often. So paper-based asset management strategies are one of the huge benefits of commercial property, but make sure you understand exactly where your portfolio sits with these. Don't miss those dates, and good luck with getting those lease renewals done. I look forward to seeing you next time on the Commercial Property Podcast.